Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Friday, December 3rd, 2021 podcast installment of the Silicon Insider, the only uncensored look at life and business in the Valley. My name is Mike Malone. I'm here with special contributor Scott Budman of NBC Bay Area. Our producer is Jordan Henderson. Our East Coast correspondent is Bob Grove. And our host, as always, is the Silicon Valley Business Journal. Okay, Scott. So we took Thanksgiving off. And of course, that's when the Holmes trial went into overdrive. Now, I've been jonesing to talk to you about this trial for 2 weeks now. So we got a lot to discuss. A lot's happened. You know, when we left each other last time, we were speculating if they would put her on the stand. And then, boom, it's been all Elizabeth Holmes ever since.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is common in other trials because I don't often cover court, but it's almost as if the previous 3 months didn't happen and didn't matter. Nobody was talking about investors. They weren't talking about previous testimony. Everybody was just talking about Elizabeth on the stand.
Yeah.
And she showed up late on a Friday. There were very few of us in court for the initial hour of testimony.
Did everybody scramble back? Did phone calls go out?
People were saying, "Oh, we saw your tweets," and
They
so we had
emptied
to jump back.
every bar downtown.
Yeah, it was just kind of crazy. And then for the next couple of weeks, we've had her steadily on the stand.
Okay. Characterize her.
Yeah. So as you know, she no longer dresses or has that sort of severe hairstyle that she had as a CEO.
Right.
She's dressed very nicely. Her hair is down with the mask off, which we hadn't seen for 3 months. She occasionally makes eye contact with the jury. She smiles. She's very professional on the stand. Now, this is not a big surprise.
There was a photograph of her walking along and her hair blowing, and she looked like $1 million.
Yeah, it's a much different look and a much different persona. That said, when she's on the stand, she still has the same deep voice for the most part.
Oh, she's doing the deep voice.
Yeah, and she's coming across extremely well educated about science, about Theranos' plans. The first part, and remember, it started with the defense, so her side,
yes,
was to sort of tell her origin story and the Theranos origin story and what their goals were. And you and I have talked about this before, that many a startup has pie in the sky hopes and good dreams,
yes,
and sometimes it just goes south.
That's how she's presenting it.
It seemed to be that
I really
way.
believed it. Empirically, it seemed like it was going to work. Blah blah blah. Okay.
Right, sort of the origin story. And they have talked about the investors. They talked about how Elizabeth Holmes, who was worth more than anybody because she held 51% of the stock, did not cash in any stock. And that's a pretty important point, I think, to say, okay, if she was fraudulent, if
she was running a con, she would have looted it by now.
That's what I meant to say. Yes, she would have looted the till by now, and she didn't, at least according to records. We'd know if she sold stock. She didn't. So there's that. But the prosecution then got a hold of her on cross-examination, and their origin story is a little bit different. They're talking about, hey, didn't you say this to investors when it wasn't really true? Didn't you say you had military contracts? One thing that came up a lot was the fact that Pfizer and Schering-Plough logos appeared on Theranos memos for test results unauthorized.
Correct.
We even heard testimony from those two companies that they did not authorize Holmes to do that. How does she explain this? Well, I got excited. I wanted to say that we were hopefully working with them, and yes, it was unauthorized, and ultimately, I wish I could have done it differently.
So she's really using the entrepreneur defense, which was, I truly believed in it, and yeah, I kind of bluffed my way through, but every entrepreneur does that before you make it big.
Largely, yes. And remember, this was a surprise. Many of my lawyer friends and legal analysts that we talked to did not expect her to take the stand.
Yeah.
Because of what we're hearing right now, which is the cross-examination by the prosecution. So for her to say, yes, I did this, and I look back on it with regret, and I wish I could have done it differently, I don't know how that's working or resonating with the jury, but she has to answer these questions.
Sure.
And she's saying, even with some of the personnel moves, oh, this person said she was harassed and she left and she ended up talking to the Wall Street Journal, and that's part of the reason we're here. And she said, yes, we treated people badly. We were head down. We were working hard. I wish I could have done that again because nobody deserves to be treated that way.
Wow.
Right. And that's, again, I don't know if it's powerful to the jury, but it had the courtroom kind of, interesting.
Well, this is almost like the Steve Jobs, Elon Musk defense, which is, Yeah, I broke a few eggs on the way up, but look what you got.
Right. The downside for Elizabeth Holmes is
You didn't get anything.
exactly nobody got anything. The investors didn't get paid, and the patients got largely, wrong results from their tests that scared them. We've heard from a number of patients,
Yeah.
and that's been hard to defend. And there's still more cross-examination as you and I speak. There's still next week.
Did the defense position her properly, do you think?
Well, in even putting her on the stand, that was a tough one.
Right.
But yeah, I think so. Because of what we had talked about, to walk through a startup that a lot of people believed in and invested in
Right.
and sort of had high expectations for that just didn't work. And that's not at all unique to Theranos or Elizabeth Holmes. And I think what they positioned her to do was to point out that she's one in a long line of, let's call it, failures.
Sure.
But that, like you said, she didn't loot the till. She wasn't in it to get rich.
So
until
she's presenting herself the call it the Amdahl argument, which was Gene Amdahl raised several $100 million to make the super chip, built that beautiful new facility where Apple headquarters is right now. Tested the chip, it burned itself up. They couldn't make it work. All that money was lost. But nobody blamed Gene Amdahl. I mean, he was a brilliant guy and he gave it his best shot. And maybe it wasn't easy to work for, but it was a noble try. Is that how she's presenting this?
Right, and that's where a big risk comes in because Amdahl chips weren't in, say, surgical instruments.
Yes.
As they burned up. The thing that I find as someone who's been every day in this, court case, hard to forgive is the fact that she put, and clearly let's use the word rushed, the Theranos machines into Walgreens for the public. And there had to be knowledge that they weren't working.
Yes, and she put innocent people at risk.
Right, and the investors, I don't know how well they resonated for the jury because they're all rich. It's not like the jury went home and thought, poor Betsy DeVos, poor Rupert Murdoch. But those few patients, and I'm almost surprised we haven't seen more, really silenced the courtroom.
Yes.
When they were talking about
that's us.
Right, exactly. We can't relate to Betsy DeVos losing $100 million, but we can relate to someone being told
you had a miscarriage.
Yeah, or you had HIV antibodies, or you have prostate cancer. I mean, whoa, that's a scary thing of mine right now at this day and age. Woo, that's a scary thing.
Absolutely.
And that resonates with a lot of people. So I think if they're hearing that and remembering that testimony, Elizabeth Holmes saying, "I wish I could have done something different," may not be enough.
Yeah.
But again, we don't know. There's still more to go.
Okay, but how's the prosecution doing? The cross.
That I don't know. I can't quite understand.
They're still positioning themselves.
Let me back up just a bit. The last thing we heard from Elizabeth Holmes was abuse at the hands of Sonny.
Yeah, I want to get into that one next because that one just came out of left field.
Right, and we knew it may come up, but since it hadn't all that time, we thought, okay, she's going to stand on her own merits and talk about what you and I have been talking about, sort of Silicon Valley theory. Now she's saying she was physically and mentally abused, psychologically abused by Balwani, and the testimony was really, really hard to listen to. Yeah. She broke down several times on the stand. You couldn't hear anybody, a pin drop. It was that silent in the courtroom. It was mesmerizing and it was really difficult to listen to.
Okay.
We knew her partner was in there. We knew her, her mother's in there. This is just a tough courtroom.
Sonny Balwani.
Yeah.
Is who she's accusing.
Right. Her 10-year boyfriend, a man 2 decades older than her, the chief operating officer at Theranos, who we now know was not only a bully, fired a lot of people, but really didn't have any medical knowledge. He was there because he was her protector, sort of her guardian. The text messages back and forth, also rather uncomfortable.
Yes.
Both because they were, very romantic, and that's not really our business, but also when they got a little more rough and controlling. That's just hard to hear. It's one thing to see a couple in public being romantic. Oh, that's nice. That's a little public, whatever. But if you see a couple in public where there's clearly a power dynamic at work, that's much worse. That's really uncomfortable. You want to step in, you want to, and that's what we're hearing now. So when the prosecution started, one of the first things they did was to talk about Balwani, which was interesting. Hey, they went back and had her read and cry her way through several very lovey text messages.
Right.
So there she is remembering the good times, I guess.
Good times, yeah.
But again, they were together for 10 years. Is the prosecution trying to prove that in a 10-year relationship that was once loving, you can't have abuse? I don't really know where they're going with that.
I don't either. And yet I also find myself thinking, she was the CEO of this company, and she's claiming manipulation and abuse by the COO of the company, her subordinate in the firm. Now, is she doing the Svengali defense that he was pulling all the strings and he made me do all this?
Not really. A couple of questions came up. One was, did Sunny Balwani tell you, as he was controlling you, what to say to the press or investors? And she said no. She said the buck still stopped with me. Okay. Another question by the prosecution was interesting. Could you have fired Sunny Balwani?
That was my immediate question the moment I read this stuff. Fire him. You are in the position. You're not a subordinate. You know, it's one thing, sexual harassment of a subordinate, because you're in a position of power and the other person's, has to report to you. She's the boss.
Right.
She runs the company. Her name's on the letterhead. Fire him. Why didn't she?
She may have been somewhat under his control or appreciated having him around as the heavy. If you read Bad Blood, when things did go south, he had a pretty important role as, I don't know, kind of the bouncer, the heavy.
Yeah.
The guy who told people, you have to sign this, I'm going to fire you. He allegedly was involved with some of the tracking afterwards. He was the heavy. And that allowed Elizabeth Holmes to still speak to, or if you're the prosecution, lie to investors. Because remember, even as things were going south, they were still raising money.
Yeah, but a lot of these CEOs have a hatchet man in there somewhere.
That's Sunny Balwani.
And what do you do with the hatchet man? You fire him at a certain point.
Things eventually look bad for Luca Brasi.
Yes. After he's,
right,
thrown enough blood on the walls, you fire that person.
Eventually, Balwani did leave the company.
Yeah.
And we have those text messages where he then said, this was 5 years I've wasted, and you're worthless, and just really uncomfortable things. But in that questioning, could you fire Sunny Balwani? She said yes. And they kept going. Could you have fired the board of directors? Yeah. Could you have fired any of these employees? Yeah. Because she owned 51% of the stock. So one thing, at least so far, that Elizabeth Holmes has not done is abdicate responsibility. Now, she's talked about how I was surprised that the lab was in such disarray because that was Sunny's thing, or this, I trusted my lab director. So as CEO, she says I did do some delegating, and they screwed up.
And so clean house.
Right. And I don't know. There may have been, I think what the prosecution is getting at is you knew this was wrong all along. So to suddenly clean house would have been a strange move, knowing that you were lying the whole time. I think that's what they're trying to get at. But it's still unspooling for the prosecution as to what they knew when, even as things were going south. We've got to the point where the John Carreyrou article in the Wall Street Journal appears, and their text messages were very defiant.
Yeah.
And very trying to hide things.
Do you find yourself getting whiplash? She goes from being presented as the mistress of the universe to being this poor little girl victim of this overbearing, manipulative guy, all in like a week.
It doesn't matter, Mike, if I'm getting whiplash. What I'm wondering is what the jury is thinking.
Yeah.
And are they thinking there seems to be, like you just said, a couple different storylines here? And if there are, and again, I've never served on a jury either, doesn't that confuse things? What's the one story that either the prosecution or the defense is trying to tell? They both seem to be talking Theranos and investors and machines and all that line, but they also seem to be going down the Sunny Balwani line with text messages and
the
abuse.
Emotional route.
Right.
And maybe they've made an audible. They just called an audible in the middle of this and thought, the jury is listening to all this technical stuff and rich people talking about $100 million investments, and maybe it's just rolling over them. They're just going to say, well, she's another one of these rich people that manipulated things. Let's go to something they understand, which is the soap opera.
Right. There's talk, because they have filed for this, that even as Holmes exits the stand, which as I looked heavenward, maybe as early as next week sometime. I don't know when this is going to wrap up, but when she does, even though she's the star witness, the defense may call someone else, and that person would be a domestic abuse doctor or expert,
right,
to perhaps talk about
Stockholm syndrome.
Well, just
by the CEO.
Well, but Elizabeth Holmes is not blaming Balwani or the abuse for her decisions and for Theranos's situation.
She doesn't have to.
Maybe she doesn't have to. Maybe that's what this other doctor does. To point out women in abusive relationships might say, I'm still doing fine at work and I'm still running the show and I'm still getting money from investors, but there may be something she's missing, and that may be partially responsible for the downfall of the company. I don't know this, but that's what a domestic abuse person who's in court with us, right, and we've interviewed, is saying is likely to happen next.
Okay.
So there's still more to come.
I mean, and then the prosecution will say, could you have called a security guard and had them escort Mr. Balwani out of the Theranos headquarters?
That was an interesting question to say, could you have fired him?
Yes, I think it revolves on that. She can't be the victim and the person in charge simultaneously.
Well, but that seems to be the story that they're talking about right now, that she's a victim domestically while still in charge professionally. And I don't know how they square the two of them.
Yeah. That's going to be interesting.
Right.
You got a fun week ahead of you. So when's the trial next week? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday?
No, Monday is off. So it's Tuesday through Friday, full days.
Wow.
And clearly the judge is getting a bit impatient. He has said that he would rather not have all of this go into the Christmas break. I mean, think about it. If the deliberations don't start until, near Christmas,
yeah,
I don't know how long the court takes off, but it's going to be off for a while. It's going to be down, dark for a while. And do you deliberate?
Jurors, yeah.
Right. Do you, they're not sequestered or anything, but do you deliberate over a Christmas break? Or if not, you go your separate ways with this hottest of trials, and
right,
everybody wants to talk about it. Trust me on this. And if you're a juror who has been specifically told not to talk about it, that's got to be
all the way through the holidays, all the way through New Year's.
Right. So the judge wants somehow to wrap this up before the holiday break. But there's only another week, a week and a half before that. So I don't really know how that wraps up. I mean,
okay, one last thing. Tell me about the show outside and inside. What time do you get there now?
I've been getting there at 4 to 4:30 a.m. to make sure I get a seat.
Oh man.
There's a very limited number of seats. And
it's like a giant mob outside waiting, like a rock show.
Yeah, I mean, I got there the first day at about 5:15, the first day of her testimony, and I was number, I think, 49. And there's a total of about 55 seats in the courtroom in the overflow.
Wow.
And it was like, woo, 5:15 isn't going to cut it. And it is interesting because even showing up super early, it's not just other journalists. I see retired people, I see young people, I see Holmes fans, I see detractors. There were a couple of 3 people who described themselves as artists. They were young. Yeah. They were in their 20s. Like, this is how they spend their time, and showing up at 4 a.m. They had a box. They opened up the box, and it had a wig, and it had black turtlenecks, and it had some sort of a red liquid, and it's like, hey, dress like Elizabeth Holmes. And it was set up there for everybody to see. And so there's a little bit of a carnival aspect to this.
Now, supposedly there's these, I was reading Holmes clones. I mean, and
the homies.
The homies, and some of them are like camp followers who are dressed up like her.
Right.
But there's also a number of young professional women who look like her, who are actually members of her old sorority at Stanford, and she got a hold of a bunch of them.
And it's hard to tell because no one's talking, and especially her friends. Yeah. And I understand that, their silence, their hesitancy to talk, but there are some of her friends who show up, they're supporters. And, I can appreciate that. I mean, sure. What are you going to do? She has family members there. But
her mom's been there a lot, right?
Yeah, pretty much every day, I think, her mom. And then a lot of days also her partner. And, right, it's almost hard to tell who the friends are and who the people who are just sort of dressing up, are.
The zanies.
Yeah, I mean, they're all, young and blonde, and who knows. But we have seen people who deliberately do talk and say, hey, we're here because we want to see the girl boss, and that's why I'm dyeing my hair or wearing this turtleneck or whatever. Her friends, I'm sure, are more circumspect.
Yes.
They're the ones with, Starbucks in hand, not talking to us.
Well, they're living in Atherton. They don't need to talk to the media.
They certainly don't. And I appreciate the support this has been for her, especially the last couple of days where she's been detailing her testimony about abuse.
Having your dirty laundry just exposed to the world can't be fun.
And your partner too. I mean, say that you have a girlfriend or a wife or a husband or whatever. Okay, they have had previous relationships and maybe some lovey text messages.
But nobody's reading your old love letters out to the entire world.
Right. And so that's public, but even worse is, give them, hey, they had good times with someone before me, whatever. That's nice and whatever. But the abuse has got to be super hard to listen to know that in that person's past, they're talking about this. And so it's been a rough couple of days, I imagine, for a lot of people in that courtroom.
So you're just jammed in there like sardines?
Well, part of the reason there are fewer seats than normal, I think, is because of COVID. For example, if you go to the overflow courtroom where a lot of the reporters are, because we can type and take our calls, whatever.
Complaints about the noise?
There haven't been for a little bit,
okay.
But that's because the overflow courtroom is now where a lot of the reporters go. We can type as loud as we want. But there are still sort of taped boundaries, so we're not quite as close as we could be. And everybody's masked inside. But it's gone from 3 months of, I got this whole row to myself to everybody's here.
Yeah, elbow to elbow.
Yeah, I mean, the network crews are here. I've talked to people from Australia.
How'd you like to be one of these correspondents that's coming in here to cover the trial, and you've been living at like Motel 6 for the last 3 months?
Yeah, I've talked to some of them, and they're not as enamored with downtown San Jose.
And how many times can you rinse your underwear in the sink,
Yeah, this shows it's not a glamorous life. People that I've talked to are like, wait a minute, you have to get up early? You have to stand outside for hours to get in a courtroom? I thought you were just putting on makeup and talking. And this is one of those things where no matter what, there's work to be done here. These are super long days.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you're on something that,
the whole world's listening to you right now.
Yeah, I haven't been able to go anywhere in the last 3 months without, what does she sound like? What is she doing? Did Balwani come into it? People are following this like they'll follow, a tabloid reality show or something.
So is a verdict going to be our Christmas present this year?
Yeah, I think the judge wants it. By then. I'm sure he's got other matters.
I'm sure the jury does too.
And the jury, because again, if they have to deliberate over Christmas, I don't even know how that happens.
Yeah.
Because
they're going to have to go home, and all their neighbors are going to be talking to them everywhere they go.
Right, and this started, remember, in August.
Yes.
So this has been
This started in the bright sunshine. Now it's raining and gray.
Right, and it's Christmas almost.
Yeah.
So I don't even know if they had any idea that, it's one thing to say I'm putting my job on hold or whatever to show up in court for months, but to say holiday plans.
When's Hanukkah?
Hanukkah's right now. We're in the midst of it.
Yes, right now, isn't it?
Right. So, but Hanukkah is not the kind of thing that you miss work for or go on vacation for. You'll just you do it as life goes on. It's not like you plan a Hanukkah vacation. Right. But you do, whether you're Jewish or not, plan often to go away during the Christmas holiday because your kids are off, your work is, whatever. And for these people, what do they do? Are they expected to put travel plans on hold so they can deliberate? I just don't even know.
I'll be interested in some of your interviews with the jurors after it's all done.
And sometimes, from what I understand of those who have covered court a lot, the jurors do talk afterwards. Sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
Sometimes they write books. And who knows what they've. I feel for them. They've given up months of their time.
A large chunk of their lives.
Yeah,
yes,
and it'll be interesting to see if they do want to talk or if they get agents or however this goes.
Okay, well, we got a few other things. We had a big bombshell this week. Jack Dorsey.
Yeah, he probably had the second busiest week to Elizabeth Holmes.
Yes, he did. So all of a sudden, out of the blue, he's leaving Twitter, and I guess he's going to focus on Square again, right?
I think Square and Bitcoin largely.
Well, yeah. Well, the rumor is
which brings us to number two.
That he wants Square. He gave it a new name?
Yeah, it's not even Square anymore. It's Block, as in blockchain.
Blockchain,
As
yes,
in,
but
as in,
yeah.
I don't know, something stronger than a square.
But he's sort of talking about making Square / Block into the bank of crypto, which is interesting. I mean, so did he get tired of Twitter and all of the, showing up in Washington and testimony and being the bête noir of, half the country and all of that, to thinking, I got a really good opportunity over here. So did he leave Twitter, or was he drawn back to Square by the opportunity?
I think a little bit of both. I think what he's not saying, but we do know, is that there are activist shareholders at Twitter who have asked for his dismissal.
Yeah.
Not because they don't like Jack Dorsey. He's well liked and respected in the Valley. End of story. He's created a great deal of wealth and jobs, etc. He's Jack Dorsey. But there are two Twitters. One is the service that is necessary for those who want to get their news.
Yes.
It's how we, people like me, get the news out. It's how people absorb the news.
Yeah, Twitter's like your biggest audience, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's important. But then there's the other Twitter, which is the business side of things. And that's been less successful. The stock price hasn't moved all that much. Hey, it hasn't even moved nearly as much as Square.
Yeah.
So, and it hasn't certainly been anywhere near Facebook or even Snapchat. In other words, it's lagging in the social media space, whereas it's super important in the news space.
Yes.
But a CEO has sort of both jobs. And I think the activist investors, emphasis on investors, are saying we want someone in there to juice the stock price.
Right. Bring the numbers up.
Yeah, who knows if this will be that change. But for Dorsey, it would be nice to not have to worry about that.
I think the change in his physical appearance has shown that he's been under a lot of stress.
Yeah, I agree.
One of my basic rules is when a man changes his facial hair, he wants to change his life.
It's funny, you're not the first person that's told me that.
Yeah, and looking at him, he went from being, hip-looking guy to being the Unabomber, and it's got to be just the pressure.
Yeah, and if the pressure, it's one thing to have pressure on what you do as a business, and Twitter's doing great as what it does.
Sure.
But it's another thing to have pressure when you've got investors saying, hey, we want a higher stock price. Who wants to deal with that when you're an idea guy?
Yeah, you have to look forward to those shareholder meetings.
Right. And so someone else gets to do that. Someone handles Twitter. He's still on the Mount Rushmore of social media because he helped launch it.
Yeah.
And now he goes over to Square, which is in a unique position. Square stock, by the way, has been on a huge tear.
Yes.
Largely, I think, because it's doing what the banks are too cowardly to do, which is to accept crypto and the blockchain and all that. And as that's gotten larger and larger, largely because of speculation, but also just because people are getting into it, Square has said, let's be the place where people can come and do it safely and securely. And the banks are still saying, we feel better dealing in dollars and checks and all those old-timey things. And so Square is positioning itself somewhat uniquely to be a safe, secure, well-respected, I guess,
and it's
place.
Finance. Nobody puts heads of finance front and center in our cultural life.
Right.
He can go back to being, the legendary Jack Dorsey and, that sort of thing, and not have to deal with being a media star.
Yeah, so, watch what Square does in the crypto space.
I'm looking at Elon's new haircut and thinking, I wonder if Elon's starting to feel the stress too.
Well, look, you bring up Elon. Another thing that people said about Jack Dorsey was, can he really focus on Square or Twitter if he's doing both at the same time?
That was always the question.
Yeah, and, Elon obviously has got some weird superhuman thing going on because he's got all these different companies.
Yes.
And still finds time to, rag people on Twitter. I don't know where he sleeps or how, but
including Jack Dorsey.
But Jack Dorsey, I know better as a person, and he's a human being, and I don't understand how he was able to do both at the same time.
I watched Twitter, basically wreck Evan Biz
Yeah.
when they were running the place. It's not an easy place to work at and operate in.
No, because like any social media company, it's a two-headed beast. You've got what you do, and then you've got the investors.
Right.
And, it just kind of shows you how important, let's say, Sheryl Sandberg has been to Facebook.
Absolutely.
Because, Zuckerberg's not talking to investors or sales. That's all Sheryl Sandberg. And Zuckerberg can be the idea person.
And she's the adult in the room.
Yeah.
Always has been.
Right. And the deal that they must have made to keep her through all this stuff is, yeah.
Okay, quickly, the markets react. Omicron. Just when we think we're out of the game, we get pulled back in. Okay, so the market's reacting. There's talk about shutting down our borders, quarantine international visitors. Are we going back into the same thing we've been going through for the last 2 years?
Well, but right, let's.
Of course, they say Omicron's been around Africa for a long time.
Right, and that's why it keeps showing up in the United States and everywhere else because it's already here. They discovered it there, the scientists, but it's everywhere. And I think what we need to do is just pause for a second. Remember, Delta was going to shut everything down.
Right.
And it did slow things down, but society kept on going and traveling. And
yes.
Okay, maybe Delta was the reason people finally got vaccinated or got their booster. And maybe Omicron will be the same thing. And hopefully it's not worse.
Well, we hope it's a milder variant.
Right.
Because if that's the case, maybe everybody gets it.
Well, or gets vaccinated because people have to start understanding that this doesn't go away for a while.
Well, maybe it becomes, maybe it's cowpox. I mean, that's how they took care of smallpox, is just found a weaker variant and just gave it to everybody.
I mean, isn't that what a vaccine is?
That's what a vaccine is, yeah.
Yeah, and that's my medical knowledge. I've already reached
We've topped out.
Thus ends the conversation. Yeah, get vaccinated, whatever.
Okay, as long as we're on Omicron, Google now has moved back the date of everybody coming back to work. So they're now they're talking about the spring?
I just don't know why we're still talking about dates and tech companies.
Yeah.
Tech companies are doing fine.
Right.
Where some are in the office and most people are still at home and
you come in 2 or 3 days a week.
Yeah, and they're doing fine on their business side, and I assume because they're being careful, they're keeping their people safe and good for them. So
we haven't heard of any super spreader events around.
Right. I'm not worried, bless their hearts, about Google workers or Facebook workers or Apple workers. They're being taken care of and they have good health plans. I'm worried about the frontline people with all these variants. Right. Having to deal with people who are not protected or who are, this is around and is going to be around not because of the tech workers, but because of the people who are still out and about. And I don't have an answer for that other than try to protect yourself.
Well, obviously our biggest companies think we have a future around here. I mean, we've got Google is, wait a minute, there's basically a whole bunch of leases taking place in the last week.
Right.
Meta, Apple. There's a huge complex downtown San Jose that just got bought up. I mean, these companies are doubling down on staying in the valley. And is that a good sign? I mean, I find myself ambivalent because half of me goes, well, that means the valley's going to survive because the big boys are staying here. But the valley's strength has always been startups. If I don't see more successful startups, I start to worry about this place. Because then we just become Detroit.
Right. It's good news unless you're trying to buy a house.
Yeah, well, that's...
And here's the concern. I work with a lot of young people. I interview a lot of young people. They're all freaked out about their housing situation. And that's a lot of young people who might say, I'm going to go elsewhere. And that's where I'm going to start my company. And then the Silicon Valley loses its, say, farm club or whatever we refer to as the startup culture.
Yeah, the AA. I mean, that's what it's always been.
And that's the concern, and housing is doing that because it's still crazy, even as the rest of the country starts to see a little bit of dip in prices and more inventory coming on the market.
Yeah.
We, according to Realtor.com, are doing the exact opposite for 2022. Less inventory, higher prices, and how does that even happen?
Yeah.
Because we are building, but apparently not fast enough.
It seems like they're building like crazy around here. Everywhere I go, I'm seeing apartment houses and townhouses and condominiums going up.
And that is what we need. And maybe as time goes by, that will lower prices and keep some of the young talent here. But the big concern is that they will go elsewhere and we'll lose that startup culture.
And I don't think people are leaving anymore. I mean, I'm looking around my neighborhood. Every single house in my neighborhood is being worked on right now. Everybody that's here that's got their house is upgrading, and then they retire and move to Utah or something where they can get a cheap house. Housing prices are insane.
Yeah.
I mean, I get all the real estate flyers, and I see things like, I see a house that I know costs $75,000 when I was in college, and it's listed at 2.1 million, and it sells for $400,000 over the asking price. It's like the numbers are so crazy now that all you do is kind of shake your head. You don't even try to puzzle out the logic of it.
Think about how much you need to make
yeah.
as a young person to somehow put a down payment on that home.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't see an easy answer to it. Okay, finally, before we run out of time, we spent so much time on the Holmes trial. Black Lives Matter has announced, their national arms is announced a boycott of white companies until New Year's Day, encouraging supporters to help, quote, end white supremacist capitalism, unquote, by visiting only black-owned businesses during the holiday shopping season. And I read that, I thought to myself, is there a single black-owned technology company out there?
It's a good question.
I mean, if I'm a Black Lives Matter adherent and I want to be part of this boycott, does that mean no electronics this Christmas for my kids? No new computer, no iPhone? I mean, what would classify as a black-owned technology company?
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, shareholders obviously own companies, and you could say, well, we have a certain number of shareholders of color, but that doesn't mean you're controlling the company.
We got that guy on our board. Yeah.
Right. That's not and tech companies become woefully short on that.
Will it have any? First of all, will the boycott work? I don't know, but if it does, will it have a material effect upon Silicon Valley companies, tech companies?
I mean, I doubt it. This is not getting enough traction to where, it's a big thing. What we have seen, and we've seen this in the last couple of years, not so much a boycott of white companies, but a press to support black-owned companies.
Right.
And I'm from Oakland. It's easy to find restaurants, clothing stores, and it has been. We did that for holiday gift giving. Hey, let's do our shopping. Black-owned Oakland companies. Let's support the hometown, and that was easy. But it didn't come with a boycott of white companies.
Yes, that's a whole different ballgame.
Right, but to say, hey, we're going to specifically seek out black-owned companies is still a bit of a challenge, unfortunately, but it's very doable, and it's a way to put your money back into your community.
Absolutely.
But the boycott, I don't know. We'll have to follow that, I guess.
I'm sure we'll talk about it next week. If it gets any traction, we'll be talking about it.
Yes.
Okay, that's it, everybody. More on the Holmes trial next week. Scott's going to be getting up at 4:15. You can find us on the Silicon Valley Business Journal homepage, as well as on Spotify, Anchor, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.